At 6:20 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey lifted his SBD Dauntless dive bomber from the deck of USS Enterprise, leading 32 aircraft on a mission that would change the course of the Pacific War. His target was the Japanese carrier strike force that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, now approaching Midway Island with 4 fleet carriers, the most powerful naval formation Japan had ever assembled. Intelligence said the Japanese carriers were approximately 200 miles northwest of Enterprise's position. But the ocean is vast, and carriers are small targets. If McCluskey's pilots couldn't find them, the Japanese would destroy Midway, then turn on the American carriers and win the battle that could decide the war. Enterprise was the ship that naval planners in 1940 had wanted to retire. Commissioned in 1938, she was already considered obsolete by 1940. When Navy strategists were designing the next generation of carriers. The new Essex-class carriers would be faster, larger, carry more aircraft, and incorporate lessons from early war reports. Budget constraints meant building new carriers required scrapping old ones. Enterprise was on the list for decommissioning in 1942 to be replaced by newer, better ships that would win the modern war everyone knew was coming. But the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, changed those plans. Enterprise was at sea delivering aircraft to Wake Island when the attack occurred, avoiding the destruction that devastated Battleship Row. She became immediately valuable simply by surviving. The Navy needed every carrier it had, obsolete or not. Enterprise, the ship they'd wanted to scrap, would become the most decorated vessel in U.S. Navy history, earning 20 battle stars over 3 years of continuous combat, more than any other American warship. She would participate in nearly every major Pacific battle, survive multiple kamikaze attacks, and sink or damage 71 enemy ships, including those 4 carriers at Midway. Now at dawn on June 4, 1942, Wade McCluskey was searching for those carriers with 32 dive bombers and fuel for approximately 3 hours of flight. If he didn't find the Japanese carriers soon, his pilots would run out of fuel and ditch in the ocean. If he found them, his obsolete aircraft launching from an obsolete carrier would face 200 Japanese fighters and the most experienced naval aviators in the world. If you want to see how the obsolete carrier they wanted to scrap became the most successful ship in the U.S. Navy, hit that like button. It helps us share these stories where being good enough to survive proved better than being perfect on paper. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're diving into the career of the Gray Ghost, the carrier that refused to die. Back to 1938 and the ship nobody thought would matter. USS Enterprise, hull number CV-6, was commissioned on May 12, 1938, at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia. She was the second Yorktown-class carrier, following USS Yorktown, CV-5, commissioned in 1937. The Yorktown-class represented a transitional design, incorporating lessons from earlier carriers while remaining constrained by Washington Naval Treaty limitations that restricted carrier tonnage and displacement. The ships were intended as interim vessels until better designs could be developed. Technical specifications of Enterprise demonstrated both her capabilities and limitations compared to later carriers. Length overall, 827 feet. Beam at waterline, 83 feet. Displacement, 19,800 tons standard, 25,500 tons fully loaded. Powered by 9 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, drive and Parsons geared turbines, producing 120,000 shaft horsepower, turning 4 propellers. Maximum speed, 32.5 knots, approximately 37 miles per hour. Range at cruising speed, 12,500 nautical miles. Aircraft capacity, 90 aircraft in 1938. Though this varied throughout the war as aircraft sizes changed. The armament consisted of 8 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in single mounts, 4 per side. Anti-aircraft defense included quadruple 1.1-inch gun mounts and 50 caliber machine guns, though these proved inadequate against Japanese aircraft and were upgraded throughout the war. The armor protection was minimal by battleship standards, but adequate for carrier operations. 4-inch belt armor, 1.5-inch deck armor, designed to protect magazines and machinery spaces from cruiser-caliber shells and bombs. By 1940 standards, Enterprise had problems. The flight deck was considered too small for the larger aircraft being developed. The elevators were too slow, limiting the rate at which aircraft could be moved between the hangar and flight deck. The anti-aircraft armament was recognized as inadequate against modern attack aircraft. The fuel capacity limited operational range. Naval architects designing the Essex-class carriers were addressing all these limitations, creating ships that would be 50 feet longer, carry 30% more aircraft, and have 3 times the anti-aircraft firepower. Naval planners in 1940, before Pearl Harbor, were advocating for retiring the Yorktown-class carriers as soon as Essex-class ships entered service. Budget documents from 1940 show proposals to decommission Enterprise and Yorktown in 1942-43, using their crews and aircraft to man new carriers. The logic was sound. Resources were limited, newer carriers were superior in every metric, maintaining obsolete ships was inefficient. One planning document stated, "The Yorktown-class carriers represent interim solutions that will be superseded by Essex-class vessels. Retirement of CV-5 and CV-6 upon commissioning of CV-9 and CV-10 is recommended to optimize fleet efficiency." Then Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The attack destroyed or damaged 8 battleships, killing over 2,400 Americans and bringing the United States into World War II. The Pacific Fleet's carrier force, which had been at sea during the attack, became immediately critical. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were the only fleet carriers available in the Pacific. The planned retirement was canceled. Enterprise, the obsolete carrier nobody wanted, was suddenly invaluable simply because she existed and could fight. Enterprise's first combat action was providing air cover for the Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942. While USS Hornet carried the B-25 bombers that would attack Tokyo, Enterprise provided fighter cover and anti-submarine patrol. The raid was a morale boost, but strategically minor. Enterprise's real test came at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the engagement that would determine whether Japan or America controlled the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, had intelligence indicating Japan would attack Midway Island in early June with overwhelming force. Decoded Japanese messages revealed the attack plan, the forces involved, and the approximate timing. Nimitz had 3 carriers available: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the latter having been hastily repaired from damage sustained at the Battle of Coral Sea. Against them, Japan was sending 4 fleet carriers with veteran pilots who had fought since 1937 in China and had destroyed the European colonial fleets in Southeast Asia. The mathematics favored Japan: 4 carriers versus 3, 250 Japanese aircraft versus 230 American. Japanese pilots averaging 800 flight hours versus American pilots averaging 300 hours. Japanese torpedoes were superior. Japanese Zero fighters outperformed American Wildcats in most categories. And Japanese carriers were commanded by Admiral Nagumo, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack. American advantages were limited: intelligence about Japanese plans, Midway's land-based aircraft providing additional striking power, and the element of surprise if American carriers could position themselves before being detected. Enterprise departed Pearl Harbor on May 28, 1942, as flagship of Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance was a cruiser admiral, having never commanded carriers before, but Admiral Halsey was hospitalized with illness, and Spruance was his recommended replacement. This appointment would prove fortuitous. Spruance was cautious, methodical, and willing to listen to his carrier commander's tactical advice, traits that would serve him well in the coming battle. By June 3rd, Enterprise was positioned northeast of Midway, waiting for Japanese carriers to appear. The morning of June 4th, search aircraft reported Japanese carriers approximately 200 miles northwest of Midway. Spruance made the critical decision to launch immediately, catching Japanese carriers while they were recovering aircraft from the Midway strike and vulnerable to attack. Enterprise launched 32 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters at 7 a.m. Hornet launched similar numbers. Yorktown would launch later. The attack plan was simple. Torpedo bombers would attack first, forcing Japanese carriers to maneuver and drawing fighters down to low altitude. Then dive bombers would attack from high altitude while fighters were out of position. But the plan fell apart immediately due to navigation errors, radio failures, and Japanese combat air patrol effectiveness. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, flew to the expected intercept point and found empty ocean. The Japanese carriers had changed course after being spotted by American patrol aircraft. McCluskey had a decision: return to Enterprise with his bombs, or search for the carriers despite dwindling fuel. Standard doctrine said, return to the carrier when the target wasn't found at the expected location. Preserving aircraft was more important than risking them on uncertain searches. McCluskey's fuel gauges showed approximately 45 minutes of flying time remaining, barely enough to return to Enterprise if he turned immediately. But McCluskey understood the strategic situation. American carriers had positioned themselves based on intelligence about Japanese movements. If the Japanese carriers weren't where predicted, the entire American plan was compromised. Returning to Enterprise meant the Japanese would attack Midway unopposed, then turn on the American carriers with full strength. The battle would be lost. McCluskey made the decision to search despite fuel constraints, reasoning that finding and damaging the Japanese carriers was worth losing his aircraft. He later said, "I knew we might have to ditch in the ocean, but ditching with bombs aboard seemed wasteful. If we were going to lose the aircraft anyway, we might as well lose them after attacking something valuable." He flew an expanding square search pattern, a standard naval search technique where the aircraft flies straight legs that gradually increase in length, covering maximum area in minimum time. At 9:35 a.m., having searched for 35 minutes with fuel running critically low, several of his pilots radioed that they needed to turn back or they wouldn't make it to Enterprise. McCluskey ordered them to return, keeping only the aircraft with maximum fuel remaining. He was now down to 18 aircraft from the original 32, flying further from Enterprise each minute, with fuel for perhaps 20 more minutes of searching. At 9:55 a.m., McCluskey spotted a white wake on the ocean surface below, a Japanese destroyer heading northeast at high speed. The destroyer was Arashi, which had been attacking the American submarine Nautilus that had attempted to torpedo the Japanese carriers earlier. Arashi was returning to the carrier formation. McCluskey reasoned that following the destroyer's wake would lead him to the carriers. He altered course to follow the destroyer's track, gambling his remaining fuel on the assumption the destroyer knew where it was going. At 10:20 a.m., after following the destroyer for 25 minutes, McCluskey spotted the Japanese carriers. What he saw was extraordinary. 4 carriers sailing in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled for another strike. The carriers had just recovered aircraft from the Midway attack and were preparing to launch against American carriers that Japanese scouts had finally located. The decks were covered with aircraft, fuel lines were connected, ammunition was stacked beside aircraft, and the carriers were maximally vulnerable. McCluskey also saw the remnants of torpedo bomber attacks that had preceded him. American TBD Devastators from all 3 carriers had attacked the Japanese formation between 9:30 and 10:20 a.m. Of 41 Devastators launched, 35 had been shot down by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The attack achieved no hits. But the Devastators had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level, exactly as planned, leaving high altitude undefended. McCluskey's dive bombers were at 14,000 feet. Below them, 4 Japanese carriers were vulnerable. He ordered attack. The 32 SBD Dauntlesses rolled into their dives at 10:22 a.m., descending at 70-degree angles at speeds exceeding 250 miles per hour. Japanese carriers frantically tried to launch fighters and turn into the wind to launch more aircraft, but they needed several minutes to clear their decks, and McCluskey's pilots gave them seconds. The first bomb struck carrier Akagi at 10:26 a.m., penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar where armed and fueled aircraft were parked. The explosion ignited aviation fuel and detonated bombs, creating secondary explosions that tore through the carrier. A second bomb hit Akagi's flight deck near the stern. The carrier was mortally wounded in seconds. Simultaneously, dive bombers from Yorktown attacked carrier Soryu, achieving 3 hits that turned the carrier into an inferno. Enterprise pilots shifted targets to carrier Kaga, achieving 4 hits that set off catastrophic fires. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning and sinking. The fourth carrier, Hiryu, had separated from the formation and escaped the initial attack. Hiryu launched a counterstrike that damaged Yorktown severely, forcing her abandonment. But Enterprise launched a second strike that found Hiryu at 5:00 p.m. and hit her with 4 bombs, setting her ablaze. By evening of June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers were destroyed or sinking. Japan had lost the experienced air crews that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the carriers that had given them naval dominance, and the strategic initiative in the Pacific. Enterprise's role was decisive. Her pilots had sunk 2 carriers directly, Akagi and Kaga, and contributed to sinking the other 2. The obsolete carrier that naval planners wanted to retire had just won the most important naval battle of the Pacific War. Admiral Nimitz would later write, "Enterprise's attack at Midway demonstrated that existing carriers, properly employed with good intelligence, could defeat superior forces. The battle vindicated the decision to retain all available carriers rather than pursuing theoretical optimal fleet composition." Midway was only the beginning of Enterprise's combat career. Between June 1942 and May 1945, she participated in every major Pacific campaign except the initial Guadalcanal landings, where she was being repaired from Midway damage. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24, 1942, Enterprise was escorting transports reinforcing Marines on Guadalcanal when Japanese carrier aircraft attacked. At 5:14 p.m., radar detected incoming Japanese aircraft 44 miles out. Enterprise launched additional fighters and turned into the wind to maximize maneuverability. At 5:41 p.m., the first wave of 36 Japanese dive bombers broke through fighter cover and began their attacks. Enterprise twisted through violent evasive maneuvers, her captain ordering hard turns every few seconds to throw off Japanese aim. The first bomb missed by 15 feet to port, the near miss, buckling hull plates and causing minor flooding. The second bomb struck the flight deck aft of the No. 3 elevator, penetrating through to the gallery deck before exploding, killing 35 men and destroying the starboard 5-inch gun mount. The third bomb hit near the same location seconds later, passing through the same hole and exploding deeper in the ship, killing another 39 men and causing severe fires. Damage control teams immediately attacked the fires while the ship maintained operations. Despite the damage, Enterprise continued launching and recovering aircraft. Her aircraft engaged Japanese carriers, sinking the light carrier Ryujo and damaging the fleet carrier Shokaku. Enterprise withdrew from the battle area at 6:45 p.m., fires under control, making 24 knots despite damage that should have crippled her. She reached Pearl Harbor on September 10th, underwent emergency repairs that normally required 4 months, but were completed in 6 weeks through round-the-clock work, and returned to combat October 16th. At the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26, 1942, Enterprise faced the largest air attack she would endure during the war. Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku launched coordinated strikes totaling 110 aircraft. Enterprise's combat air patrol and anti-aircraft guns engaged incoming attackers, shooting down 27 Japanese aircraft, but the sheer numbers overwhelmed defenses. At 10:17 a.m., a bomb struck the flight deck forward, penetrating to the third deck before exploding, killing 40 men. At 10:18 a.m., a second bomb hit near the forward elevator, destroying the elevator and causing massive fires. Enterprise's damage control teams again proved exceptional. While fires burned and wounded men were evacuated, repair crews shored up bulkheads, controlled flooding, and maintained power. The ship continued operating aircraft throughout the battle. When USS Hornet was crippled and forced to abandon ship, Enterprise recovered Hornet's aircraft despite her own damage, cramming over 180 aircraft onto and into a carrier designed for 90. She withdrew from the battle area, making 18 knots, barely operational but afloat. The Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th to 20th, 1944, saw Enterprise's aircraft participate in the destruction of Japanese naval aviation. The battle, remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, pitted over 400 Japanese carrier aircraft against American fighters equipped with new tactics and technology. Enterprise's air group shot down 86 Japanese aircraft confirmed, with her pilots accounting for nearly 1/5 of the 350 Japanese aircraft destroyed. One Enterprise pilot, Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes, becoming an ace in a single engagement. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, Enterprise provided air cover for the invasion forces and attacked Japanese surface ships attempting to destroy American landing forces. Her aircraft sank. The Japanese carrier Zuiho and damaged the battleship Ise. Throughout 4 days of continuous operations, her pilots flew 652 sorties, more than any other carrier in the battle. The kamikaze threat intensified in 1945 as Japan adopted suicide tactics. Enterprise faced her first kamikaze attack on May 14, 1945, off Okinawa. At 6:56 a.m., a Zero fighter evaded anti-aircraft fire and crashed into the flight deck forward of the forward elevator. The aircraft's 500-pound bomb penetrated through the flight deck to the gallery deck before exploding, tearing a 30-foot hole in the flight deck, killing 13 crew members and wounding 68 others. Fires spread to aircraft parked on the hangar deck. Damage control teams extinguished the fires within 20 minutes. Flight deck repair crews, working under fire as Japanese aircraft continued attacking other ships in the formation, welded steel plates over the hole, reinforced the damaged structure, and had aircraft launching again 4 hours after the hit. This rapid repair under combat conditions demonstrated the experience and skill Enterprise's crew had developed through 3 years of battle damage. The carrier earned her nickname Gray Ghost because Tokyo Rose, the Japanese propaganda broadcaster, repeatedly announced Enterprise had been sunk, yet she kept appearing in battles. Japanese pilots reported sinking her multiple times, but she continued operating. The Japanese military became convinced either that America had multiple carriers named Enterprise, or that the ship was somehow supernaturally protected. The reality was effective damage control, skilled repair crews, and luck. Enterprise survived 3 kamikaze hits, direct bomb hits on 6 separate occasions, torpedo near misses that caused underwater damage, and strafing runs that killed crew members on deck. Her damage control teams became legendary for their ability to repair battle damage and return the ship to combat readiness. After the kamikaze hit on May 14, 1945, that killed 13 crew members and tore a 30-foot hole in the flight deck, damage control teams had the deck repaired and aircraft launching within 4 hours. The statistics of Enterprise's combat record exceed those of any other American warship. She participated in 20 major battles, earned 20 battle stars, more than any U.S. warship in history. Her aircraft sank or damaged 71 enemy ships, 4 carriers, 14 cruisers, 32 destroyers and smaller warships, and 21 merchant vessels. Her aircraft shot down 911 enemy aircraft confirmed, plus hundreds more unconfirmed. Her anti-aircraft guns shot down 185 aircraft attacking the ship. She covered 320,000 miles during the war, more than 13 times around Earth's circumference. The human cost was significant. Enterprise lost 1,100 crew members killed during the war from battle damage, operational accidents, and other causes. She had 2,200 wounded, many permanently disabled. Her air group losses exceeded 300 pilots and aircrew killed or missing, but she brought home thousands of men who would have died had she been sunk, validating every repair that kept her fighting. By 1945, Enterprise was exhausted. 3 years of continuous combat operations, multiple battle damage repairs, and constant use had worn her machinery to the point where she needed extensive overhaul. With the war ending and dozens of new Essex-class carriers in service, the Navy planned to retire her. She returned to New York in December 1945, decommissioned, and awaited her fate. The Navy initially planned to preserve Enterprise as a museum ship, recognizing her historical significance as the most decorated warship in U.S. history. Proposals suggested New York Harbor, where she could be moored near the Intrepid Sea, Air and Space Museum location. Other proposals suggested Washington, D.C., visible from the National Mall or Pearl Harbor, returning her to where the war began. Congress authorized initial funding for preservation in 1946, appropriating $500,000 for preliminary studies and ship stabilization, but post-war budget cuts, competing priorities for reconstruction funding, and bureaucratic delays prevented action. The Navy argued that preserving Enterprise would require $3 to $5 million for towing, dock construction, restoration, and initial museum development, money that Congress was unwilling to appropriate in the late 1940s when domestic programs took priority. The ship remained anchored in Bayonne, New Jersey, deteriorating from neglect, while preservation plans circulated through committees without resolution. By 1950, Enterprise had been abandoned for 5 years. Rust covered her hull, her flight deck was warping from weather exposure, and her interior spaces were flooding from leaks and deteriorating seals. A Navy inspection in 1951 determined that preservation would now require $8 million due to deterioration that had occurred since 1946. The cost had nearly doubled because early preservation funding had been delayed. Throughout the 1950s, veterans organizations petitioned Congress annually for Enterprise preservation. The Enterprise Association, formed by former crew members, lobbied politicians and raised funds for private preservation. Newspaper editorials across the country condemned the Navy's neglect of the most decorated warship. Admiral Chester Nimitz, retired, personally wrote letters to Congress advocating for preservation, stating, "Enterprise earned her preservation through service to the nation. Allowing her to deteriorate is disrespectful to the 1,100 men who died aboard her and the thousands who served." By 1958, Enterprise was in poor condition from 13 years of abandonment. A Navy survey determined preservation would require $12 million for restoration, plus $1 million annually for maintenance. The Navy decided scrapping was more economical than preservation. The announcement on July 1, 1958, that Enterprise would be sold for scrap triggered immediate and intense public reaction. Public protests were immediate and intense. Veterans organizations petitioned Congress with over 100,000 signatures, demanding reversal of the decision. Newspaper editorials condemned the Navy's choice. The New York Times editorial stated, "Scrapping Enterprise is cultural vandalism. The nation that cannot preserve its most decorated warship has forgotten what those decorations represent." The Washington Post editorial argued, "We preserve buildings where famous people lived. Surely we should preserve the ship where 100 Americans died defending their country." A fundraising campaign tried to raise money for private preservation. The Enterprise Association launched a public appeal seeking $10 million for purchase and restoration. Donations came from across the country. Veterans sent their pensions, school children sent allowances, businesses contributed. By December 1958, the campaign had raised $600,000, far short of the needed $10 million. The Navy set a deadline of June 30, 1959, for raising sufficient funds or the ship would be sold for scrap. The fundraising campaign failed to reach its goal. On July 1, 1959, Enterprise was sold to Lipset Corporation for scrapping at a price of $561,333, barely more than the fundraising campaign had raised. The sale price was considered insultingly low for the most decorated ship in Navy history. Critics noted that Enterprise's scrap value was less than the cost of a single fighter aircraft, that preservation was being rejected over amounts the Navy spent daily on routine operations. Enterprise was towed to Kearny, New Jersey, beginning in 1960, where she was systematically dismantled. The scrapping took over 2 years due to her size and the robust construction that had kept her alive through 3 years of combat. Parts of the ship were saved before scrapping: the nameplate, displayed at the Washington Navy Yard; the ship's bell, given to the Enterprise Association; the ship's wheel, preserved at the Naval Academy; sections of teak; decking, distributed to museums and naval installations; the forward 5-inch gun mount, preserved at Patriots Point Naval Museum. The scrapping was controversial, and remains controversial among naval historians who consider the decision short-sighted and disrespectful. Modern historians note that the $12 million preservation cost in 1958 dollars would be approximately $110 million today, far less than the cost of modern museum ships that attract millions of visitors annually. USS Intrepid, preserved in New York, cost approximately $70 million to restore and attracts 1 million visitors annually, generating economic activity that justifies the preservation cost. The Navy somewhat acknowledged the error by naming the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, USS Enterprise CV-65, commissioned in 1961. The nuclear enterprise served 51 years before decommissioning in 2012, carrying on the legacy of CV-6. A third Enterprise, CVN-80, is currently under construction and scheduled for commissioning in 2028, continuing the name for a third generation. The legacy of CV-6 Enterprise extends beyond her combat record. She validated the doctrine that carriers, not battleships, would dominate naval warfare. Her survival demonstrated that effective damage control and crew training could save ships that should have been lost. Her success proved that incremental improvements to existing designs could be more effective than waiting for perfect new designs. And her career showed that obsolete equipment properly used could defeat superior equipment improperly used. Modern naval analysts studying Enterprise's record identify several factors that explain her success despite being considered obsolete. First, her smaller size made her harder to hit than larger carriers. Japanese pilots reported difficulty targeting Enterprise compared to newer carriers that presented larger profiles. Second, her experienced crew compensated for design limitations through superior training and initiative. Third, her damage control systems, though simpler than later designs, were robust and well understood by crews who practiced constantly. Perhaps most importantly, Enterprise benefited from being available when needed. Naval warfare is often decided by forces present rather than forces theoretically optimal. Enterprise was present at Midway when newer carriers didn't exist. She was present at Guadalcanal when newer carriers were still being built. She was present through 3 years of war, accumulating experience and success, while planners' perfect carriers were still on drawing boards or under construction. The debate over whether to preserve Enterprise continues among naval historians. Those who supported scrapping argue that 1958 economic conditions made preservation financially impossible, that maintaining museum ships is expensive, and that preservation of CVN-65 Enterprise made CV-6 preservation less critical. Those who oppose scrapping argue that CV-6's historical significance exceeded any financial consideration, that funding could have been found if preservation had been prioritized, and that losing the most decorated warship in Navy history was cultural vandalism. May 12, 1938 was when Enterprise was commissioned, already considered interim design, soon to be superseded. December 7, 1941 was when Pearl Harbor made her invaluable by simply surviving. June 4, 1942 was when her obsolete aircraft launching from her obsolete deck sank 4 Japanese carriers and changed the war. May 14, 1945 was when she survived her last kamikaze hit, refusing to die despite damage that should have sunk her. July 1960 was when she was scrapped, ending the career of the ship naval planners hadn't wanted, the carrier that earned 20 battle stars, the gray ghost that proved being good enough to survive mattered more than being perfect on paper. One carrier, obsolete by 1940 standards, survived Pearl Harbor by luck, won Midway by skill, fought for 3 years. Without sinking, earned more decorations than any American warship, and proved that perfect is the enemy of good enough. Not because she was the best carrier ever built, because she was there when it mattered. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support preserves these histories of ships that refuse to die and crews that refuse to quit. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We honor those who proved that survival and persistence beat perfection. Thank you for keeping their stories alive.